It's something I really would never be able to explain or put in words. How do you describe going through so many days not knowing where your child is, whether she's safe, whether she's crying out for you? Well, she's home now and appears to be okay. I don't think she really understands what happened, and I try not to talk to her about it. These are the words, of course, of parents of a child who was kidnapped, disappeared from the family for 11 days of what really was a nightmare, right? This is the child of Aslam and Dekta. This is the parents, Aslam and Salma Dekta, right? Aslam and Salma Dekta. Their child was taken for 11 days. We've told you about this on the rise in South Africa, and there's now, according to the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, a real danger that South Africa is developing into a kidnapping country. That is the reputation we are increasingly at risk of having. I'm joined now by two experts, Herman Bosman, who is the head of kidnapping, hostage survival and extortion at TSU International, as well as Dr. Guy Lamb, who's a criminologist and lecturer in the Department of Political Science at Stellenbosch University. A very good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Perhaps let's start with you, Dr. Guy Lamb. This warning by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, we know this is a crime, in a common crime at least, in places like Mexico, Colombia, and many parts of the world. In South Africa, this is fairly new to us.
Well, yes and no. I mean, kidnapping has been with us in the sense of different types of kidnapping. I mean, we're talking about kidnapping for ransom, which has been quite rare. I mean, it's happened from time to time, but we've always had kidnapping in relation to carjackings, where people are kidnapped and taken to ATMs, or it's kind of associated with robbery, or we see kidnapping that's associated with kind of intimate partner issues or with domestic issues in relation to families. But the sort of kidnapping for ransom certainly hasn't been a big issue up until a few years ago. So this is something in terms of something that's deeply concerning, because we're seeing increases in this, and certainly it's getting a lot of media attention, and sort of an indication that there are organized criminal groups that are starting to specialize in this, and are seeing it as a lucrative area to generate an income from.
It started off, I think, outside of the context you've just outlined, as syndicates operating and targeting, I suppose, individuals of wealth and social standing, foreign nationals, for example. We've seen Pakistani and Bangladeshi syndicates operating in South Africa, but increasingly we are told even in poor communities, people may be targeted. And of course, in those instances, often the point is not to bring them back.
I mean, the issue with people being targeted, I mean, we've seen probably diversification in the activities of organized criminal groups. You've seen what COVID did and sort of economic downturn has done to the normal or kind of legal economy, but it's also affected the illegal economy. It's meant that organized criminal groups have diversified their activities. So we've seen, increases in extortion-related crimes, for example. So the kind of move towards doing more kidnapping is certainly a trend, an upward trend that we're seeing. And it's, an indication that, these organized criminal groups are looking for targets, not necessarily kind of high-value targets, but targets where they'll be able to extort some form of money out of individuals, or some form of favor, or kind of some form of decision that needs to be made. So certainly this is not something that's just affecting, wealthy families. It's affecting poor families as well.
Because, of course, there's also the prospect of human trafficking from these crimes.
Well, yes and no. I mean, we don't have a huge amount of information about human trafficking. It does happen from time to time. We've certainly seen this in other parts of Africa. Southern Africa, not so much, but that does happen from time to time in relation to kind of Muti. But these are exceptional. Most of the kind of kidnappings that we're seeing, especially of kind of children, are related to ransom payments, because, it's somewhere where you can make fairly substantial amounts of money compared to human trafficking, where the returns would be lower.
Herman Bosman, here's the question. If you're a victim of this as a family, what do you do? Do you pay the ransom that is required, that is demanded of you for the safe return of your loved one? We're always advised not to. What would you say?
Well, this isn't a very straightforward topic as far as pay or not to pay. I think it's much more complex than that, and many factors to be taken into consideration. of which obviously payment is one of those, where families targeted. It's very difficult if payment can secure the safe release of your loved one not to pay. So the debate will always continue, and I think maybe people that's never been affected will advocate to say, but just don't pay. Well, that's very easy if you're not sitting in a predicament where a loved one is taken, and the sole outcome tends to look to be, and also as covered in the media, that payment does secure the release, and therefore payment will always be one of the considerations.
And also, I mean, how do you convince a family not to pay if, for example, they don't think that they're going to get quick results from the police?
Well, we must also understand that the criminals and the kidnapping syndicates that operate do plan properly to a certain extent, and it's not something that is just easily sorted by the police like many other crimes that is easier to address than the kidnapping that's much more complex with various grouping syndicates and the manner in which they operate. So the expectations may be that the police must just step in and solve it, but that's not going to happen. It's much more complex than that. And we need to not just look at it from the police perspective, bottom up, but we need to address this top down from the executive, the legislature and judiciary. How can we address kidnapping as a crime and a rising threat to the economy and the country in general? And look at different other aspects that need to address first, macro elements, before we get to the policing side of it.
And what do we as citizens do? What do we as parents do? Missing children, South Africa tells us that every 5 hours a child disappears in this country.
Well, certainly there's many guidelines and tips that one can provide, such as routine and times that you travel, making available group movements that we refer to as the buddy system rather than walking alone, knowing your area very well that you function in, having areas at and around your home well lit. We also know that the majority of kidnappings happen between home and work or home and school traveling. So to make sure that on your arrival location it's safe and on your departure location it's as safe as that you can have it with camera and also lighting. And I know it's frightening to think of it that we came to this, but this is what it is. That's why I refer back to my original statement that we need to look at this from a different perspective, from top down, and that is how do we address this as far as witnesses and as far as victims being able to give testimony in court? What is the minimum sentencing or prescribed sentencing? How do we define and investigate? These macro elements you need to address first before we can go forward with this.
Dr. Guy Lamb, you're hearing what Hadman has to say. The society as a whole needs to have a look at this legislation. All sorts of factors need to be taken into account. Are we taking this threat seriously enough?
I think we are. I mean, it's one of these things where the state does need to catch up. You know, there's a sense of around that this type of crime wasn't a common crime within South Africa. We have kind of multiple common crimes which the police and kind of the justice sector and crime prevention sector have been trying to deal with. So absolutely, we need to be kind of looking at kind of prioritizing this. But I mean, there are some things that, you know, that we could be doing more of and concentrating more on, especially crime intelligence. We know it was undermined for many, many years, certainly from about 2009 onwards, and there's internal factional battles happening within that particular sector and leadership challenges. And of course, that undermines the ability of the police to monitor organized criminal groups. Because this is not, you know, this kidnapping is just not happening by random groups, as Herman has pointed out. You know, these are organized criminal syndicates. So if you've got good crime intelligence, and police can be monitoring and infiltrating these particular groups, and in a way kind of preventing kidnappings or having good enough intelligence that you're able to rescue kidnapped victims. But we're not at that stage yet. We need to do a lot of rebuilding within crime intelligence. So it's not only that, but of course then it is about looking at how do we protect children more effectively. It's not only about sort of kidnapping, but it's also about general violence against children. We need to be prioritizing that a lot more. So there is certainly more we can do, but certainly I think the state is recognizing that this is an increasing crime and needs to prioritize it.
Dr. Guy Lamb, appreciate your time, as well as Herman Bosman. They're my two guests on this issue. And I would imagine to every parent, the warning that we must all be aware of is knowing what our children are doing online and how that activity may make them vulnerable to this kind of thing.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions,
your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.